Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our call to help us unpack the elements of a meaningful, brave conversation about race. Let me start with a scripture in 2 Corinthians 1:3, and it reads, "All praise to God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. God is our merciful Father and the source of all comfort." As people charged with extending the healing ministry of Jesus Christ, we need to look at him for guidance always, particularly at times like this. You know, emotions right now are raw and exhausting, yet we are called to continue the dialogue and continue to educate ourselves. The scripture tells us that God is a merciful Father, which can be translated, mercy can be translated as compassion or showing empathy, which is something that we truly need through these conversations. It also says that he is the source of all comfort, which results in encouragement. And for these conversations to go well, we need to show empathy and offer comfort that results in encouragement. So please join me for 2 minutes and watch this short video from Brené Brown about empathy.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, "I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed." And then we look and we say, "Hey, climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone." Sympathy is, "Ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich?" Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, "I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me." Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Marcus, you're on mute.
Mute. Okay.
There you go.
All right. Can you change to the? Oh, all right.
Yes.
So thank you. Today we're going to provide a framework to address sensitive conversations about race. So let's place ourselves in a learning mode. Let's avoid distractions. Please mute yourself. I think you're already muted. If you have any questions, please go on the chat box and send all questions to Tiffany Capellas directly. Tiffany Capellas. And she will prioritize and bring them up at the end through our Q&A session. So today I have asked Warren Chalklin to guide us through this process. Warren is a white man, and I think many of us can relate to how uncomfortable these conversations can be. It's okay to be uncomfortable. It is not okay to give in to fear. So I have watched Warren have these conversations regularly with associates of all races, genders, different walks of life, and somehow he manages to become their best new BFF. So please give him your attention as he walks us through this presentation. Warren?
Thank you, Marcos. Thank you very, very much. Hello, everybody. Thank you for just taking this time out at such short notice to be present for such an important conversation such as this. Professionally, my name is Dr. Warren Chokla. I'm the manager of cultural competence, diversity, and inclusion under the leadership of Marcos's Health, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Benefit Department. And really, our department's role is to support Christus in responding to moments such as this. And so what we're going to be working on today is a result of a team effort, and I just want to really acknowledge that. I've had the pleasure of connecting with many people whose names I recognize in the chat, but there are many of you who may not know who I am or anything about me. I like to joke and say that my accent is from El Paso, Texas, but actually it's from South Africa. I am South African. I grew up, I'm fourth generation South African. And one of the things about South Africa is we're famous for three things. One, we're famous for instituting the first concentration camps in the world. Secondly, we're famous for a system of segregation called apartheid. And thirdly, we're famous for an African philosophy known as Ubuntu, which is a principle of humanity. Now, I share those three contradictions in a way, those three pieces, because those three pieces have really shaped my life. I grew up through the transition from apartheid to democracy in South Africa. I was the first generation to go to integrated schooling. But more importantly, I have the privilege of having a sister of color, Melissa. She is a Black woman, and she came into our family before the end of apartheid. So we still had legalized segregation at that time. And so being a mixed race family, living in a segregated society, what you see on your screen is signs that we grew up with. And one of my earliest memories was when Melissa came into our lives and my mom went to get Melissa's birth certificate. And whenever you would walk into a public building in South Africa, there would be a police officer who would have a pencil in his or her hand, and they would stick it in your hair. And if it stuck, you were a person of color, which meant you couldn't go into that entrance. You had to go into another entrance. But if it fell out, then you were either white or Indian. You were classified as Indian. Everybody had a racial classification. Well, of course, the pencil fell out of my hair, but it stuck in Melissa's hair. And in my young mind, having to navigate who is going to take Melissa into this public building and why we can't go into the same entrance and all these traumas, to be honest, was one of the first times in my young life that I began to recognize the existence of racism. The existence of race, what a person's skin color looks like, how determines how they are treated. Now, as a white person growing up in South Africa, I was advantaged by having white skin. I could go into any entrance I wanted, frankly. But it also awakened me to an awareness that just because I had a Black sister did not necessarily mean that I didn't benefit from these advantages that racism had in South Africa during apartheid. So I want to share that because my life's journey has been about not only recognizing that and acknowledging that lived experience, but also about using those lived experiences to advance racial understanding, to advance compassion and empathy, and also to advance anti-racism. And so I come into this humbly as a white person in the United States. Although I'm South African, I'm still a white person. I come into this conversation with a lot of limitations. I do not have the experiences that many other people have had. But what I do have is experience in engaging folks in difficult conversations around issues of race, gender, and class. And so what I want to share is some frameworks that we can use as an organization to deepen our practice. So there's a lot that I still have to learn, but I'm hoping that what we share today is something that will help you as a leader in the organization, not only tackle sensitive issues such as race, but also issues such as class, immigration status, and even conflict resolution. These frameworks we're going to learn today are really helpful across all of those. So thank you so much for joining us, and I really do appreciate any feedback that will come from this session. So on that note, I would like to begin by taking a deep breath and recognizing where we are as a nation right now, and in fact, the world. It is important, before we get into any learning, to ground ourselves in the current moment of the world and particularly of the United States. I want us to take a second, and wherever you are, I'm going to ask you to turn off your camera for a moment, and I'll let you know when. But when your camera is turned off, no matter where you are, I'd like you to sit in the moment of reflection, to think about the lives that have been lost as a result of racial injustice. Many of us have family members even who have lost their lives as a result of injustice. And so before we can even begin to engage, I want us to take a moment, just very briefly, to sit in that. So if you could turn off your camera, and I'll let you know when to turn it back on. I'm going to do the same. I'm going to ask you to please take a second and just sit in that moment. Okay, wherever you are, please could you turn back on your camera? Thank you very much for that. And Tiffany, if you could please locate my camera and turn it on. I think it's been lost in the sea of folks whose cameras are off. So on that note, I want to shift us into thinking about Christus and where we are as a Christus ministry. Christus Health condemns racism and acts of violence, and will work to bring positive change whenever we find acts of injustice and structural inequality. We commit ourselves to extending the healing ministry of Jesus Christ through realizing a just world based on our core values of dignity, integrity, compassion, excellence, and stewardship. We are anti-racist because we choose to do the work of building a just world in solidarity with all oppressed and marginalized peoples. It's important that before we even begin to have conversations about the future and even about the present, that we acknowledge where we have come from and the injustices that are part of that history. And I'm very proud to be part of an organization, proud of our department, and proud to be part of a team that acknowledges the historical injustices that have taken place. So in that note, I'd love for us to think about what our expectations are coming into this session. Now, the training and development team are probably used to this, so forgive me, but I'd like to talk about Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. And that is, ladies and gentlemen, the distance between what you know now and what you don't know. And the gap between those 2 points is difficult and uncomfortable. If you can ever think about having learned how to drive or having learned a new skill, there is a process of uncomfortableness that's baked into that cake. And so if you feel uncomfortable during the next hour and a half, I'd like you to reflect on embracing that feeling, because, hey, that's learning. That's what learning feels like. Okay, it's not a comfortable process. But in sensitive issues such as race, those feelings of uncomfortableness can create certain reactions in us. In those moments, I'm asking if you can lean into that with compassion, both for yourself and for the other person. All right. Remember during this session to remain muted. We're going to be using the chat function and having a question and answer at the end. So if you have any issues during this time, please use the chat and reach out to Tiffany, and we will make sure that you're taken care of. But from where you are now, my hope is that we can begin to traverse that zone of proximal development, that zone of learning, to get to a point where you can practice these skills. So what is our learning outcomes? Well, you're going to learn and practice the RACE model to engage in sensitive conversations. You're going to identify personal stories to connect with and expand with members of your team. You're going to utilize empathy to build bridges between people. And you're also going to recognize and manage your personal triggers entering into conversations. Okay, so let's recognize the different perspectives that people bring to the conversation. Often when folks will say, you know, I had the talk with my children, I hear that a lot. My friends and my colleagues are having babies now, or their kids are going into high school, and they're talking about the talk. And I often have to ask them, what does that talk mean to you? And what I found was that depending on who you are, that talk, the idea of the talk looks a lot different. And this is an example of that. For certain folks, the talk is about the birds and the bees, from father to son or from parents to children. But in the context of racial injustice, the talk can also be about how to equip your children to avoid being killed by the police. Okay, and I use that term very broadly because it's nobody's fault if they get killed by the police unjustly. Okay, it's not their fault. However, parents are having the talk to equip their children with certain behaviors and skills to avoid escalating the potential of violence. Okay, and so in these conversations, and the purpose of these conversations that we're going to be learning about how to have today is about understanding those perspectives, understanding what the talk, for example, means for each person in the room, because we all have different experiences and we all have different perspectives, and we can only learn about those in the process of dialogue. So why do we as leaders struggle to have brave conversations? Now, I use the word brave very particularly. This is not a safe space. This is a brave space. A safe space assumes that everybody's safety is the #1 priority. That's not what this is about. This is about a brave space. Remember the zone of proximal development? Safety is you stay where you are. Being brave is about extending yourself. And that's what we're hoping to do today. Now, in my role, I come into contact with a lot of leaders and a lot of associates. And after the conversation, I spend a lot of time taking notes and reflecting on how I can be a partner with that particular leader. And as I was preparing for the session, there were 3 quotes that came up in my notes that I thought could reflect some of the experiences that we might be having as leaders. So one of which was, I feel comfortable having conversations because I'm afraid that I will say the wrong thing and offend somebody. Okay, something I hear often. So I'm afraid to say something. I want to say something, but I don't know what to say. Another quote I hear so often is, I feel guilty if I am silent, and I feel like my team expects me to think that I don't recognize what is happening, but I don't know what to do. If I say something, I'm afraid I'm going to offend somebody. If I don't say something, I feel guilty about that. Okay, so there's a tension there. And also I've heard many associates say, how do I speak to my manager about how I am feeling about racism without risking my job or potential opportunities? So these are perspectives that I hear a lot. Now, if you'll remember, we've spent a lot of time in the internal quadrant. When we think about racism, there are 4 main areas in which racism operates: the internal, the interpersonal, the institutional, and the structural levels. Okay, now, Christus Health has invested a lot of money in helping us understand our internal wiring. If you remember the frontal lobe, when we talked about unconscious bias, those are the internal conversations we are having with ourselves and how those impact our teams. And Fierce Conversations has been a great help in supporting that understanding of our internal wiring. What we're trying to do now is take the next step in that journey, which is talking about how does that internal wiring affect how I interact with my team members. That's the next step. However, I want to make it very clear that this is not a silver bullet. What we are learning about today is one tool in a plethora of tools available to you. But the interpersonal realm is but one level. There are far more levels, such as institutional and structural levels, that we will eventually be able to explore. But right now, in this hour and a half together, we're going to be focusing on the interpersonal, the relationships that you have between your managers and associates. So that's where we're going to be today. So there's two scenarios in which these conversations happen. The first one is where you as a leader initiate the conversation. And the second one is where you as a leader use conversations that are happening as opportunities to engage. So let's say you as a leader are aware of what is happening in the world right now and want to engage in that conversation with your team. Here are some tools you can use. One of the things I learned having a diverse group of friends is that in moments of racial crisis, how I approach them can have a positive or negative impact on them. And what I found was that friends of color that I had who are close to me, who I've grown up with, when I wanted to support them during that moment, they were very receptive to that. However, as I began to sort of go down the rung of people that I wanted to reach out to, I realized that the reactions I was getting was completely different. And I had to reflect on that. And what I realized was that there were specific things I did not consider before engaging in a conversation with my friends and with my team members. So before you want to begin to initiate the conversation as a leader, here are some things to consider. Number one, is it appropriate to reach out to a team member? Do you have a relationship with this team member? Number one. If not, press pause. Okay. Before entering into that conversation, is the purpose of this conversation to make you feel better? Or is it to center the associate in that conversation? All right. If you feel like, yes, I do have a relationship, and yes, I do feel that I want to center the associate, and it's appropriate, here are some tools that are really important for you. The first one, and the most important one, I would say, is to avoid centering yourself or asking what you should do. The main purpose of the conversation is to listen and be told what it is that you need to do. If there is any, sometimes just listening to the person is enough. Your job is not to solve the person's problem. Your goal is to partner with the person. Okay. So when I hear statements like, I can't imagine how you are feeling, versus what experience are you feeling right now? Notice the difference. As the manager, you're coming in, I can't imagine how you are feeling. You're inviting the person to explain, you're centering yourself. I can't. But what you're trying to do is actually center the person. What experiences are you feeling right now? And things you really want to make sure that you are paying attention to is acknowledging pain. Letting the person know you support them. Listening and engaging in empathetic presence to ensure that you are listening to what the person is saying, both verbally and non-verbally in the conversation. Pause and listen is probably the most useful tools in these conversations. We're going to be practicing these more over the course of this session. But here's some conversation starters that you might want to use. And we're going to provide these slides right after the session. So please, for the moment, just go through these slides with us. One thing you could say is, as your manager, I have a personal interest being present and relevant to my associates' needs. How can I best serve you during this time of racial unrest that our country is experiencing? I recognize that we have all room for growth. And I'm interested in hearing from you and learning about some ways I can serve as a more inclusive leader. How can Christus, and this is later on in the conversation, right? So you're starting these conversations saying, I am present, I am present, I am listening, I am engaging. And let's say the conversation progresses. It is appropriate to say, how can we as Christus be a better advocate? If you have a close relationship, it's appropriate to say, you know, I have never witnessed this, or I have limited experience in this. Can you help me understand whether you've witnessed or experienced any forms of systemic racism? And do you have any ideas about how we can elevate the workplace culture to be more reflective of Christ's character and love? So that's the last two, and the last three, I would say, are if you have built a long relationship, if you have a strong relationship with somebody and they feel comfortable engaging in that kind of conversation. You don't want to go up to somebody you don't know very well and say, hey, what do we need to do? What action plan do we need to put in place to solve systemic racism at Christus? And put the burden on them. That's not the goal here. The goal is to engage in that conversation. Okay, wonderful. Now, what happens if somebody makes a controversial statement and that might open the door for a conversation? Okay, so for example, one of the things that I've heard before, I was down in the canteen area, and I was standing behind a manager and a black executive and another leader. And the white leader turned to the black leader and said, you know, you're not like those other black leaders at Christus. You know, I really enjoy working with you. You're not like other black leaders that I've worked for in the past. Okay. Now, in my mind, I am deconstructing how this conversation. So I've got my receipt, because of course they give you a receipt and they make you wait about 25 minutes for your burger. And I'm trying to wiggle up to hear how this conversation is going. Okay. Now, in that conversation, the person just literally shut down the conversation. All right. The person who received that information, the conversation went straight into the football that was going on in the weekend. Okay. I could see immediately that there was a shutdown and there was a movement. Now, what I want to talk about is if that moment had to happen again and the person felt comfortable, how that conversation could have been different. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the rules of engagement when we go into these kind of conversations. Okay, the first one is, it's not about agreement, but about learning. We're going to put you in breakout rooms in a little bit, and you're going to have some tough conversations in there. I'm not asking you to agree, I'm asking you to enter into with learning. Okay, remember that empathy is one of the key things here. You don't have to have the person's experience, but you can recognize their experiences. Understand that intent is different from impact. I do not know what that person meant when they said, you are not like other black leaders. And I have never been told, I've been told you're not like other white South Africans, but I know that that's not the same. I recognize that that's not the same. I don't know the intent, but I know the impact, at least for me, when people tell me that, I'm not sure exactly how to take it. The impact is different from their intent, okay? So again, I'm not assuming their intent. All I can see is the impact that had, all right? So we've got to understand that our intentions are not as important as our impact. It's what the impact that we need to measure things from. Okay. Now, the purpose of the conversation is not for those impacted by racism to educate or to provide a list of tasks, but to share experiences and deepen understanding. It is not appropriate to say, what should I do? Without actually having done the work of going on Google and finding out strategies and reading and educating yourself about things. It's not fair to put the burden on other people to do the work that you should be doing, okay? And remember that conversations are a process, not a destination. We are not advocating the model of a conversation. We are advocating the model of conversations. And that's very, very critical in this process, okay? Now, what is our framework? Dr. David Camp built the framework called the RACE framework: reflect, ask, connect, and expand. When we think about reflection, we're thinking about ourselves. What are your personal biases and what is my strategy going into the conversation? The key thing about this conversation is you're not just entering into it, you have actually practiced certain tools and techniques that you can use to engage in the conversation. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The second piece is ask. Instead of offering a statement to a statement, you're asking a question about the statement. And the key thing you're trying to do is shift the person from belief or statement to experience underpinning that belief or statement. So for example, when the person said, you know, you're not like those other Black employees, I would ask the question, can you tell me about your experience of working with Black employees? And shifting the person into that zone will help me find areas of connection. Often in these conversations, I'm reflecting on my trigger words, and I'm focusing on my trigger words, when in actual fact, I should be focusing on the areas of connection that I have with the person. Once you ask them to share their experience, to share their stories, you then share a story with the theme that they may have, okay? And then expansion is you tell another story to expand their perspective. So let's look a little bit about what that looks like. So when you're reflecting, you're thinking, number one, have I checked myself? Have I checked my biases going into this conversation? Do I bring a heart of understanding and learning, or do I want to be right? Something that's very, very important is if you enter the conversation around racism wanting to be right and not shifting the person, you are in fact reinforcing the status quo. If you're working, or at least attempting to shift the person's perspective when it comes to racism, that is an act of anti-racism, okay? So the question of being right is irrelevant. The question of shifting an perspective is the goal, all right? Building trust. So one of the things as well that you need to recognize is your trigger words. So for example, when I spoke about when the person said, you're not like those other Black employees, the term other Black employees was my trigger in that moment. I recognized, okay, there is underneath this person's words, there is something to explore there that has elements of racism in that statement. Okay, so that is my trigger. My blood was boiling, my shirt, I was forgetting what burger I ordered, right? So I had to identify my trigger words. Then I have to be aware that in conversations that are sensitive, there are elements of denial, diminishment, and deflection. So when I begin to engage with folks, I can expect them sometimes to say, racism does not exist. Racism does not exist. Or they may say something like, racism exists, but it's not as bad as it was before. You know, Jim Crow is over, slavery is over, right? So they're diminishing the impact. Or they might say, racism is not as bad as xenophobia, or racism is not as bad as X, Y, and Z. You know, we call this whataboutism, right? And again, practicing your stories. Okay, so we'll talk more about the stories in a moment. So that's the question about preparing yourself for the conversation. Now the conversation's here. What happens? We center ourselves. We breathe. Even if your insides are boiling. I mean, I'm sitting there in the canteen. I feel like the AC has been turned up. You know, I've got to center myself. I've got to be okay with that. Listening for the connection points in the person's story, not the trigger points. Okay, I'm really struggling to hear that, but where can I find an area of connection with the person's story? And then in my conversation with myself, when I open my mouth, what words am I going to use? Because might I use words that trigger the other person? Okay, we'll talk about that. We're going to do a role play in a second and we'll reflect on that. And remember, the goal is to build trust and open the space for the next conversation. The goal is not to have a Band-Aid. The goal is to create a relationship that opens up the potential for shifting. Okay, so on that note, we've reflected, we begin to ask questions. So let's say in a world, there was a world in which I was somehow involved in this conversation with with these three folks. Or let's say the Black executive wasn't there, it was just a conversation with another white executive and myself, for example, okay? And they said, you know, again, for those who might have just joined us, the executive says, you know, Warren, I like working with such and such because he's not like those other Black employees. Okay, so I'm triggered, I've reflected, I'm breathing, I'm waiting for my burger, but I'm breathing, I'm relaxing, okay? I'm centering myself. I asked the question, that's so interesting, what is your experience like working with Black employees? And notice that I use the word experience. The person might say to me, you know, I've worked in the past with diverse teams and I've really had difficulty working with Nigerian associates because I can't understand them. I can't understand them when they speak, right? Now, there's a lot of triggering words in these statements, okay, but I'm listening. So one of the questions I could then ask is, so it sounds like communication is one of your key leadership challenges. Notice how I'm building out a theme. I'm not focusing on the specifics of the story. I'm trying to locate a theme within the person's story. So I could say something like, so it sounds like communication is one of the largest challenges in your team as a leader. How have you overcome some of those challenges at Christus? I'd love to learn more. The person might say something like, you know, what I like to do now is actually get my team to write down their answers, to write down things rather than tell me because I struggle to understand it, right? Now, connecting is thinking about communication. What story do I have in my repertoire that can connect me to this individual story of having communication challenges as a manager? Notice I'm not talking about race right now. I'm talking about communication challenges. So I might share a story about how I've had communication challenges. And I would say something like, you know, when I first came to this country, I sat in lectures with professors from all over the world who taught statistics, for example, and I could not understand a single word that they said. And I asked them to write things down after class. So I can really connect with that. I mean, it was struggling for me because I had these tests and I would not understand because my ears were not tuned to people's accents. And even to this day, people don't understand my accent. So I can really relate to the frustration of the difficulty of communicating as a leader in a team. I'm connecting. So when you're connecting with somebody, you're thinking about a story that aligns with an element of the other person's story, okay? You're not saying that they are dumb. You're not judging them. You're finding an area of connection with that person. And then what I would do is then tell them another story that expands their perspective. So I could say something like, you know, it's very fascinating that, you know, I have had experiences where as a South African, people have not wanted to work with me because of my accent. And what I found was that really impacted my work. It really impacted my feeling of inclusion in the team, and it really impacted the way in which I showed up and my engagement in the team. And so I'm wondering that, you know, it sounds like communication is a really big issue and a really big challenge for you as a leader. But I'm wondering how, you know, you differentiating certain Black people from other Black people in the organization is being felt by members of your team. And I'm wondering if there's, you know, something there that you could probably explore that could help boost not only the communication, but the engagement of your team. Because you know, it sounds like there's some communication issues, but also it sounds like there's something a little bit deeper there that could be impacting your team and their engagement. What do you think about that? Right? So what I'm trying to do is now begin to address the question of the statement, you are not like those other Black executives. I'm getting there. I'm building the groundwork. I'm fertilizing the groundwork for the person to then reflect with me and respond to me about, hey, it's not only about communication, but there might be some unconscious bias there. Okay. And so notice that I don't say things like unconscious bias. I don't use the word unconscious bias. Now, in this first reflection with them, I don't use the word racism. I don't use these specific terms that could trigger this person. What I do is plant the seed of how is their attitude impacting their team, more broadly than just communication. I'm planting that seed in the conversation and asking them, what do you think about that? You know, it sounds like communication is an issue, but it sounds like this perspective might, you know, be impacting other areas of your team. Like, can you tell me more about that? I mean, that's really interesting. So that the person can then begin to think broadly, more deeply about, hey, you know what, actually, if I think about them that way, how am I leading them? How am I approaching them? How are they feeling? How are they being impacted by me as a leader? Okay, and that's really where you're getting to, where the person themselves is reflecting on where they are. And you're not pushing them in that direction, because if you just went into expansion, then it's likely that they would maintain themselves and dig in a bit deeper. So on that note, we'd like to do a role play, and I'm going to ask my colleague Angela to help me in this role play. And by the way, if your camera's still off, you're welcome to turn it back on. I don't know if I mentioned that, but you're welcome to turn it back on. I'd like you to imagine a moment in which somebody says something like this: while I don't agree with police brutality against Black lives, I don't understand why we have to bring these conversations about race into our workspace. This is an environment where we save all lives. So discussions and demonstrations, so discussions and demonstrations are just not appropriate. So take a moment to read this, this statement that somebody says. Okay, now what's gonna happen is Angela and I are going to do a role play. It's gonna have two scenes to it. We will just go from one scene to the next scene. Okay, so as you're watching these two interactions, I would like you to really reflect on the race framework. Think about, okay, how is he reflecting? Is he asking questions? How did he connect with the person? How did he expand? Remember, connecting and expanding are stories, right? Listen for the stories that happen. Okay, so lights, camera, action, round one. Go for it, Angela.
While I don't agree with police brutality against Black lives, I don't understand why we have to bring these discussions about race into our workspace. I mean, this is an environment where we care for all lives. So discussions and demonstrations are just not appropriate.
Angela, I can't believe you just said such a thing. Have you seen the statistics and watched the news? I can't believe I'm friends with someone who has such deep internalized racism.
Warren, how dare you say that to me?
Okay, scene one, done. Let's go into scene two. Angela, if you wouldn't mind repeating the prompt.
While I don't agree with police brutality against Black lives, I don't understand why we have to bring these discussions about race into our workspace. This is an environment where we care for all lives. So discussions and demonstrations are just not appropriate.
Angela, thank you for feeling safe enough to share this with me. I'm really curious to understand more. I've heard a lot of people saying that Black Lives Matter is making them uncomfortable. I'm really curious, what does Black Lives Matter mean to you?
Well, I feel like if I'm saying Black Lives Matter, that I'm excluding my white colleagues. And every day we save every life that walks through the door. Why are the white coats for Black lives making it sound like all lives don't matter equally?
Wow, that's really interesting. I've never really thought about it from that perspective. I would love to hear more about your experiences, if you don't mind. What I heard you say was that like inclusion and exclusion are really important to you. And I'm really curious, we've worked together a while. Has that always been your experiences? And could you share something that just helps me understand your perspective a little bit better?
Yeah, well, I grew up as the youngest of 5 kids. And so I always felt left out because my siblings were older. So I made a promise to myself to always make sure that everybody was included. And that's really why I became a nurse.
Wow, I'd never heard that story of why you became a nurse. Wow, and also your family. You know, obviously in these professional settings where we don't always have the chance to talk about our families. I mean, I met Christus too because of the impact of my family. My family is, I think I may have shared this with you, but my family, you know, was a mixed race family in a segregated society. So the idea of feeling included and excluded was something that we experienced a lot growing up. So I just want to acknowledge, like, wow, we actually we have some connections there. But you know, at the same time, I just wanted to share this other story that I had. You know, I remember growing up, we went into a restaurant, and I remember distinctly how the waiters smiled at me, and they would frown at my sister. Okay, and you know, I remember as a kid, I would always say, you know, things like all lives matter, because I thought that if I said that, then I would be including my sister in that, right? But that experience of having people frown at her, and then also as I sort of went through life, I kind of realized that because my sister had a different skin color to me, she had a completely different experience. And when I was saying all lives matter, one day she asked me, Warren, is my black, we never talk about the fact that I'm black, because we're always saying all lives, you know, I don't see color. You know, is there something about my black skin that's a problem? And I realized when she said that, that actually, by saying that, I was excluding her. I was being unfair to her. And so, you know, Angela, it's just such a strange thing to me when I realize, like, because there is racism, saying that Black Lives Matter is actually a way of including people rather than excluding people. So I'm wondering if maybe both can be true. All lives matter and Black Lives Matter, but I'm wondering what you think about the context, you know, the situations, and you know, whether that situation means saying one thing includes people and saying the same thing excludes people. What do you think about that? Okay, scene off, scene off. Okay, so what Angela and I are going to do now that the scene has been complete, we are going to just have a dialogue, and just kind of reflect on that conversation. I know there's 138 people on the call, so in a normal setting, we would be able to hear your thoughts and your reflections. I hope you were able to hear at least some areas of questioning, connection, and expansion. But Angela, for you, what were some trigger words that you had in the conversation?
The trigger for me was definitely the label deep internalized racism. It felt like a judgment, and it shut down my willingness to have a conversation. It felt hurtful and yeah, kind of confrontational.
I felt in a similar way. I felt like, where do I go from here after that? Like, you know, even not even just personally, professionally, like how do we ever have a conversation after I've just said that and then
Right.
like left it there? That's, I mean, I felt that way.
Right. And we don't have a conversation.
And to be honest, 99% of my life feels like that. I've just said to people, you're XYZ, thank you very much, right? So I want to say like, okay, you know, that's kind of a thing that I have to own in myself. I've had those kind of conversations. But so when you think about asking questions, I know this was a role play, but you know, can you just reflect a little bit about just the piece of like asking those questions? How did that impact the conversation for you?
Well, the questions were more of an invitation, and you know, and I'll be transparent. Every day, Angela is very apprehensive about, you know, transparency around family, things like that. However, movie star Angela really appreciated the questions and the opportunity to kind of, you know, tell a little bit more about my story and kind of explain why I felt the way I did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing here, and this is for everybody on the call too, is just being sensitive to, you know, how far you can probe. I mean, some questions are inappropriate. So you might want to ask questions that can push somebody into a work-related experience, perhaps, that they could feel more comfortable, you know, reflecting on. And I'm curious about the storytelling piece. I'm not sure about what your experiences are in the past. I know I've struggled to tell stories that are meaningful, but what do you think about the power of storytelling, just in general, in conversations such as this?
Well, they're helpful, but you know, I also have to remind myself, you know, that people are not always going to have the story that builds that bridge of commonality. But you know, with the original questions, that kind of, you know, that invitation, you know, gives me the opportunity to say, okay, you know, I'm going to give this person some grace because they're trying to engage in this, you know, uncomfortable conversation with me.
Yeah. No, exactly. Like, excuse me. Sometimes we just don't have a story. Sometimes we just don't have, and that's perfectly okay. I mean, I've been practicing this framework, and there's times where I just literally don't have a story, and I don't know where to go with it. But I think just being aware of, hey, if I have 2 or 3 stories that I think could relate, then, you know, that's always helpful. Now, one of the things that I want to push back against is the idea that there was only one direction of expansion in this conversation. You know, I, as the manager in this conversation, was in the role play expanding with my story. But the truth is that the conversations are a dialogue. And so there's opportunities for expansion in the other direction as well. So Angela, for you, had this conversation sort of continued, what do you think, what would you have asked next? Where would you have liked the conversation to go from there?
Well, because we were in a work environment, I would, you know, talk about maybe meeting over lunch or, you know, meeting in a conference room and just kind of having more of an offline conversation. Because like I mentioned earlier, for me, vulnerability is something I really want to be very measured about. And so in this uncomfortable dialogue, that's something I would be willing to do in a more private venue. Yeah. But I would be open to that, just based on the conversations or the questions in the second scenario. The first scenario, absolutely not.
Yeah, absolutely, right. So I think one of the things that we have to really reflect on, and that I want to really make sure that is perfectly clear here, is that this is not a one-way street. This is a dialogue. This is a partnership. And so as leaders, we all have to have moments of expansion. We all have to have moments of growth in these conversations. So on that note, thank you so much, Angela. By the way, you're such an amazing partner in these situations. Thank you. I appreciate you very much. What we're going to do now is we are going to engage in practice. Now, before we break up everybody into their breakout rooms, I'd like to give you some very clear parameters and some very clear steps that are going to take place right now. So what you're going to do is, in the moment, please go to the calendar invitation and locate the RAC Conversation Starter attachment. So please, if you could take a moment to get that attachment. When you get into the breakout room, there will probably be, there's 135 of us, so there will probably be close to, I would say we have 50 rooms. So, you know, depending, you'll probably have 2, 3 people, in some cases 4. Zoom is just going to distribute us. And what will happen is you're going to use this prompt, okay? And the prompt is, at Christus, we don't see color, we just see people. There is no racism at Christus because we are a Catholic organization. We are all God's children. Now, questions always come about is, why do I put the dash? Part of my identity is Jewish. And so as part of the Jewish faith, we don't write God with the O, we use the dash. So unfortunately, I was the person who put together the slides, and so that's just how it went. Part of cultural diversity. So in the role play, what you're going to do is take turns after you've introduced one another and after you've taken a moment to think about it. Take turns being the manager and being the associate. You will have 10 minutes to practice, and then we're going to come back. All right. So before I go forward, please ensure that you have the attachment. Secondly, I'm going to give it 10 seconds. If you have a question, now is your time to ask it in the chat, because we're going to put everybody into the breakout rooms. So I'm going to quickly take a look at the chat. If everybody can just be patient with me for a moment. And I'm going to make sure that I am, Tiffany, please can you give me the heads up? Yes, I do. Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to put everybody in the breakout rooms right now. I'm going to have to, there we go. Just give it a moment, everybody. All right. Zoom is just asking me for permission. All right, so it says there's going to be 2 to 3 participants. I'm creating the rooms. And please get going. All right, so please ensure you are getting an invitation to join a breakout room. Please, can you join that breakout room when you are prompted? Okay, and if nobody is in your breakout room just yet, please can you wait? Because people are still accepting the invitation. So if nobody has joined your breakout room as yet, please can you give me a moment? And I'm gonna move you to another breakout room. Okay, please make sure that you have joined the breakout room. Let us know if there's nobody else in the room, and we will move you to another room. Okay, please let us know in the chat if there is nobody in your breakout room, and we will assign you somebody in the breakout room. Okay. All right, Spencer, we're going to move you into this breakout room right here. I'm going to move you into this. Please remember to accept the invitation to join the breakout room, everybody. I'm trying to assign everybody into a breakout room. Hi, do you need to be moved to another breakout room?
Hi, Warren. Yeah, I'm the only one here.
All right, I promise this is room number...
I think I'm 27.
All right, I will do that right away. Thank you so much.
Sure thing. Do I click leave the room or just don't do anything?
If you don't mind, please just don't do anything and I'll make sure that you move. So this is 28.
Talk a little bit more about this.
Yes, thank you. You helped me with that completely.
Hey, Warren.
Hi, I'm just popping in just to say hi and say hello and hi and see if there's anything I can support with.
Yeah, we were actually talking about some of the storytelling that you brought up. And so I know kind of close to the end, you had mentioned, what if you don't have a story?
Mm-hmm.
So you tell us a little bit more about that. If you are in a scenario, would you kind of reflect and maybe do lunch and come back and talk about it later?
Yeah, if not everybody has a story for everything, right? So in that situation, you can, it's perfectly okay to say, hey, could we put this on ice and connect, later, and just kind of think about things. But I think if you dig to the theme, any theme you can connect a story to. So,
Mm-hmm.
If you're thinking about unfairness, right? Or you're thinking about not being heard, whatever the theme is, you're not necessarily connecting a story with a story. You're connecting a theme with a story. So sometimes it takes a while to reflect on, like, what's the theme of the story? What is the theme of what the person's saying? What theme can I connect with? So I would encourage you in that situation to take a moment and just think like, okay, what's the theme? And do I have a story that connects with the theme?
Okay.
Yeah. I hope that helps. Okay, I'm gonna go.
Yes, it definitely does.
I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you. I'm gonna hop off and
Thank
jump in
you.
another room. Bye.
Hi, Warren.
Hi. I'm just popping in to see if I can be of any support or if everything's okay in room 1, I think. This is room 1.
Yeah, I think we're getting all the love. Tiffany just stopped in here and checked on us, so I think we got a little bit of a late start, but
Okay.
we're trucking along.
All right, perfect. Just saying hi, and if you need anything, just raise your hand, use the raise hand thing, and I'll be right back if you need me.
Sure thing.
Okay, bye.
Are open to seeing and accepting that color is someone's joy doesn't. Now I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, same here. I'm like, the doctor's
hello,
into
Warren.
Hi, Corian.
Warren, we all agreed that this is so hard because we just want to yell, "You're wrong!" That's
Yes.
No,
It's
I know.
hard, especially
And the good thing is we got 3 different colors in this.
Yes.
In this room.
I know, huh? So it's tough when your emotions are there, So
Yes, it is so. And hey, Corian, I am not. It's so funny. I said to Marcos, don't think that people are gonna be like, oh yeah, sure, I can't wait to tell a story. It's like, no.
Because I believe in correcting it right then and there.
Yeah.
I'm a person that I try to say it with grace, but I definitely, situations have happened at Chris's where people have said something, and I would say, you know what, you might want to think about, I may phrase it in a different way, but I am going to say and call it out. I'm not a person to just stand out and say, or swallow and walk away.
Totally. Yeah, and Corian, that's kind of what I'm gonna say right after. That was my next piece. I felt like I couldn't lead with it in case we get people into like breakout rooms and people are like, no, right? You know what I mean? So yeah, I'm gonna like mention that after this, that there is a place. I think she might be frozen. There is a place for that. Yeah. On that note, I better run to the next breakout room. Thank you so much for being here. It's so good to see you, Jenna. And I have not met you, Ryan. Ryan?
Yeah, we haven't met. No, Ryan.
Okay, good to meet you. Thank you so much. Alrighty, I'm gonna jump into another room and hopefully they're not cussing me or something. Let's see.
Just I will listen and hear what an individual has to say.
Warren, I think you're in the most internationally geographic room right now.
Hi, Dr. Robinson. How are you? Hi, Louise. How are you?
I picked up on your accent instantly last week, Warren. I lived in South Africa for a year, and I was like, I love it.
Oh, where about, Dr. Robinson? Where about?
I was based in Cape Town. I lived on Long Street, and then flew back and forth to Joburg and Durban a little bit.
I just moved back from Cape Town. My wife and I just moved back from Cape Town.
Oh, wonderful.
So you would understand if I said Molo Sisi.
Exactly. Oh, wow.
Okay.
And
Well, yes. Hi, Luis. Yes.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say on the conversation that we're having, I guess it depends on the culture of the person who's hearing this question. Because yes, I have a different background as well, and my question is: somebody says at Christus we don't see color, we just see people. There's no racism at Christus because we're a Catholic organization. I'd have to ask, what do you mean by racism, and what does racism mean to you? And that's, you know, I think the conversation would stem out of that then, as far as what is the person really asking about.
Absolutely. I have to bring us back. My boss is saying, let my people go. So I'm sorry that I can't dig in with you right now, but I have to bring us all back. But I promise we will connect. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
And then where are you from?
I'm from Joburg.
Oh, you're from Joburg. Okay.
I live on Clove Street, right off. Well, Clove Street, yeah. Yeah. So Long Street was our jam too.
Yeah.
Really, yeah. I'm happy to hear that, Dr. Robinson. I can't wait for us to connect in person and connect and chat.
For sure. I can't wait to come up there sometime.
Yes, absolutely. Okay.
Alrighty.
These are going to be breaking out in a few minutes. I'll see you in a second.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.
I'm just confirming, is everybody out of their breakout rooms?
Everyone should be out by now.
Okay, wonderful, 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 wonderful. Well, I think that was such a fantastic, I was able to jump into a few of the breakout sessions, and there were some key elements that arose that I wanted to mention. The first one is that expansion is appropriate in certain situations. In the sense that sometimes we have to disrupt very overt racist practices. Absolutely, we have to disrupt those practices because they're inappropriate. What we're talking about here is not necessarily those situations. We're talking about moments in which we can use opportunities to expand people's perspectives. Okay, so I just want to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge the different cultural backgrounds that we all come from. And so sometimes folks may ask a question that may sound ignorant. For example, in South Africa, we have a group classified under apartheid as colored. And so when I would say to somebody here in the US, I would say, I have a colored friend, they would say, no, you mean black. And I say, no, black is completely different to colored. And we would have to have a conversation about what that means, okay? And so in the conversations, always remember that we are coming from different perspectives. So we do want to have a question and answer session after this. We do recognize also that 10 minutes of practicing this is obviously not enough. We recognize that. However, we do have a certain amount of time to try and pack as much as we can in. And there will be some follow-up sessions as well. So some key things. Number one, when you're engaging in the conversation, remember to adjust and manage your expectations as you enter into this conversation. Remember the power of empathy. It's a very powerful weapon in brave conversations. Okay, really trying to find the theme. You're not trying to find a story that matches the other person's story. You're trying to find a theme that connects with the other person's story so that you can build a story from that. We can all connect our stories to a theme. We may not necessarily have a story to match their story, okay? Thirdly, remember the goal of the conversation is to open up the space for further conversations. It's not a once-off event, as I've mentioned before. a key element as well is, now that you have this framework, to practice and process this framework with a trusted associate first. Practice it and work through it, okay? Also, please remember, as they say, silence is complicity. To be silent in the presence of racial injustice is to choose, as Desmond Tutu says, silence in situations of injustice is choosing the side of the oppressor, okay? So, in moments, silence is a choice. Silence is an action, okay? So what we're encouraging is to actually take that step, take the first step, practice it, and find ways to cultivate this sort of reflective practice as a leader at Christus. Okay, we do have 2 slides left, and then we're going to get into some questions and answers. If you have some questions, you're welcome to start putting them in the chat. Tiffany will moderate those, and then as a group, we're going to be engaging with those questions. We're going to be launching the Racial Justice Education Campaign on Genesis. That will be launched tomorrow. Marcus will be sending out an email. And in Genesis, which is our education platform, you will find resources, videos, poems, documentaries, books that can help educate around racial justice. So please look out, and that's under the Diversity and Inclusion channel on the Genesis homepage. We'll also have it on the intranet, and that'll be coming soon. Part of anti-racism work is elevating and acknowledging the work of incredible Black scholars. When I use the word Black, I use it very broadly. And the RAC framework is actually the work of Dr. David Kampt. He developed a book called the White Ally Toolkit, and his framework is what we have been using today. So I really want to acknowledge and thank him for helping us as an organization deepen our practice. So on that note, please, there have been some questions in the breakout groups. How do we get hold of you? I want to introduce you to the Hedi team, Marcos Pesquera, who we heard from earlier, Tiffany Capellas, who has been graciously moderating the chat, as well as myself. If you would like to get hold of us, here is our emails and our information. And on that note, I'm going to open it up for questions, and we will go from there. So, Tiffany, if you will, please could you share some questions that you are hearing? And I don't have the authority to answer all questions, neither do I want to. So I'm gonna ask that we open it up for folks to answer from their perspectives as well.
Great. So our first question is going back to the application within the race model. What if the person, let me see, make sure I understand this. What if the person offended you by their statement? For example, when you stated, you are not like other Black leaders I have worked with. And they say something like, I like working with you, with full intention to compliment you. And this particular individual is, as a Black individual, do we go into telling a story, or do we educate them on how that comment is offensive?
I'm going to take that one if that's okay. So I will firstly say a few things. Number one, the work of educating ourselves about anti-racism rests with us. Okay, it is not up to people affected by racism or impacted by racism to do all the educating. It's not fair to put that burden on them. Okay, so we have this thing called Google, and I would highly encourage people will come to me and say, Warren, what do I do? And my first question is, what do you think you should do? What actions do you think you could take to learn more about how to be an effective leader, right? Because we have resources, access those resources. That's number one. Number two is, I don't want to put the burden on the Black employee to then be responsible for educating that manager. But let's say they decide, yes, they want to educate that manager. We ask questions. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by you've never worked with Black employees like me? What you know, can I understand that a little bit more? So obviously we don't go straight into a story, we ask questions. And through that offense, We've got to try and understand the perspective. But the third thing that I'm going to say is that the person's intention, frankly, doesn't matter. What the person's intention was doesn't matter. It's the impact that matters. So what we have to distinguish is, yes, the person could have made a joke. The person could have, tried to include. But if those actions result in exclusion, that's really what we've got to try and unpack. So what the RACE framework helps us do by asking questions and finding connection points is shift the meaning, getting to the meaning of the joke or getting to the meaning of the statement and unpacking that together and talking about how that makes people feel and really trying to unpack to give the person the tools to be appropriate and to be inclusive. Because the person thinks they're being inclusive. But what we've got to try and do is help them understand that they're actually not being inclusive. But we can't do that sometimes by just telling them that. We actually have to draw them into reflecting on those statements themselves. And that's really what this framework is trying to do. Because if we tell them you're not being inclusive, sometimes that can entrench some of these attitudes. Sometimes that can entrench some of these perspectives. And that maintains the status quo. What we want is to shift the status quo. Great question.
That was a great question. Thank you, Warren. So this next question is concerning the expand portion. How do we keep our story from sounding too preachy or to keep it from sounding condescending?
Yes, great question. So I would say that firstly, the theme of the other person's story that you're trying to connect with. Remember, like unfairness or exclusion, you're connecting a story with the theme of the person, okay? So that has to be really authentic. You have to tell a real story. And you can also tell a story of proximity. If you don't have your own personal story, sometimes it's okay to say, I have a close friend, or I read this book, and here's what I've heard, okay? Now, in the expansion piece, it takes practice, right? But in the expansion piece, what you're really trying to do is think through what am I trying to expand? So how can let me backtrack a bit. Somebody cannot disagree with your story. Somebody can disagree with your beliefs, but someone cannot discount your story. So if somebody is telling a story and you're coming in and telling your story, you're shifting the conversation into storytelling. So I think it comes with practice, but the key thing is to be authentic and to think very clearly about what you are trying to expand or what contradictions you're trying to unearth in the conversation. And in my experience, when I kind of start floundering, I stop, I pause, and sometimes I ask another question like, hey, I'm keen to just hear a bit more. Sometimes I shift it back into the dialogue until I've figured out what I'm actually trying to say.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So our next question is, if this conversation is happening on the fly, what happens if we struggle? Which that's the reality, right? All of these conversations are really going to be happening, and you're speaking from the heart. What happens if we struggle to identify a way to connect? Any recommendations on how we can still productively advance through the conversation without stumbling through it?
Yes, I would recommend, and again, I am no expert. I'm a work in progress. I have to say that I've made many mistakes. I've rambled on for days and made huge mistakes and offended a lot of people and. Okay. The one lesson I have found is that when I find myself rambling, to stop, pause, and reflect on whether it's necessary for me, whether it's appropriate for me to continue in the conversation, or whether it's appropriate to pause and create space for the next conversation. So when I find myself rambling, sometimes I stop, pause, and say, actually, this conversation is really important to me. And I find myself having not thought through all the pieces of it in a way that I would really like to be a full partner with you. Could we give some time for me to just think through some of these pieces and come back together? I find using those kind of strategies and giving yourself a bit of time one, reminds the associate or the team member how important they are and how important this conversation is to you. But two, it gives you time to sometimes connect with your manager or connect with some trusted associates or employees or whoever you want to connect with to talk through the conversation so that you can enter the next one more prepared.
Great. So I'm getting a lot of questions around the application of this model. And so I'm going to pose this question to Marcos. How can we practically utilize this in our ministries? This has been a great training. Do we use it in one-on-one conversations, in departments? Do we schedule sharing times with invitees and open it up to all or to select groups? What model do you recommend?
I think Warren touched on two different things. One of them was the first part, which is when we as leaders start the conversation. And that I think Warren also in this PowerPoint outlined some questions that we can start conversations with. Those could be more of a small team, a huddle, those kinds, those are appropriate for that. Now, when we go through the second part, personally, I feel like it's more of a one-on-one interaction, maybe 3 individuals, because it's a more of it's vulnerable, it's personal. You're pouring your heart out in these conversations. This is not for public consumption, is what I call it. It's like if I'm telling you a story about me, you're gonna hear stuff about me that, when you're vulnerable, there's always a risk, but the risk is worth taking because of the end result and what we're trying to achieve. I think the times of, I'm not saying we of course we need to be politically correct, but let's not use that as an excuse to cut or disconnect conversations that can get us at a deeper level. And I think as managers, which and folks, all of you folks are, when it gets to that point, but let's not use the PC word to stop conversations, because we need to kind of push that barrier. So that's what I will say. I would look at the PowerPoint when we send it at the end of this, and use the beginning questions for your teams or for your huddles. But then the one-on-one, the second piece, it's more one-on-one, 2, 3 individuals, maybe 4. I wouldn't open it to more than that. Does that answer the question?
I think so. In terms of teams at the ministry levels, that's really going to be driven by the local ministry.
Mm-hmm.
That's because I have another question here. Will there be teams at the ministry level? And so I think you've answered that one. Let's see, I have another question here. What tools, training, or support can be provided to those who self-identify that they have a racial bias but want to change this?
Oh, wow. Well, I think tomorrow you're going to get this email from the Racial Justice Educational Campaign that's going to give you all kinds of tools. And I think what was said earlier about it's on us, we need to really take the time, read books, go on Google, find out. But I tell you, when you see the link tomorrow to the Genesis platform, you go through it real quick and see there's going to be just an immense amount of resources there. And that's how we can, I was thinking there's some books that are going to be recommended. If we could have even book clubs that we can go, once a month, and we go a couple chapters, whatever which way. There's some amazing recommendations that are going to be in that campaign that I highly recommend. That at lunchtime we just create something like that. Would push really the lever forward. So we have to get creative how we're going to make this happen, because each one of us have different. Our operational challenges are different, so it's really hard for me to say how is it going to go. I don't know, but you know what works for you guys, and maybe it's just 30 minutes instead of the full hour. I don't know, but I was hoping is my hope. Even TED Talks, that you can sit down and go through the Genesis platform and look at a TED Talk together in a team, and then talk and discuss about it. Obviously, as a manager, make sure you look at it first so you know exactly what the theme is, and you're ready then to address questions or have questions prepared so you can begin an open conversation.
Great. I have not received any other additional questions.
Okay.
I'm going to allow participants to now unmute themselves. And if you have a question and you want to ask it directly, feel free to do so.
This is Judy from Shreveport Bossier. Marcos, I guess I'm wondering how to implement, and I think about, there was a program when I used to work in higher education. We had, it was facilitated by myself and a campus minister, and he was Filipino, and we called it Bridging the Gap. And it was for students of all races, diversity, who wanted to come together and have honest conversations and just say, I don't understand about this perspective or that perspective, and just be able to be in a safe place to have honest conversations. So I wonder, especially amongst our leaders, there are folks who don't understand the racial injustice thing because they're white. They haven't experienced it. They haven't heard the stories. They haven't seen the pain in people and the tears, but they do want to learn. So I'm wondering if there's an opportunity to sort of start kind of conversation groups for people who.
Absolutely. I believe that. I think sometimes you don't know what you don't know, and that's why you cannot get upset sometimes with folks, because you truly don't know what you don't know. I had a conversation with somebody the other day that told me, oh no, there's nothing happened in my facility. Everything is peaceful, life is peachy, everything is great. And I asked him, and who are you talking to? Oh, my peers. And I said, what is, if you don't mind me asking, what is the ethnic composition of your peers? Oh, we're all white. And I said, okay, do you mind getting out of that comfort circle and go out and ask individuals of another ethnicity, another race, and ask them how are they feeling about what's going on? And boy, what came back, the person actually sent me an email saying, Marcos, thank you so much for the honest conversation, because I got another story when I put myself out there and asked. So that was powerful, and I think we've got to get out of our comfort zone. So yes, these conversations have to happen, and I think this way, if we can frame them in this race framework that Warren just talked about, and you'll have the information when he sends it out. I think it could be very productive. We just have to be intentional. With everything with diversity, we have to be intentional, even when it's uncomfortable. Just kind of let's push through it.
Thank you.
Great. I recognize we are over time, so I just want to conclude this brave conversation about race webinar and thank Warren for sharing this information with us today. I also want to thank Angela for insisting in our role play. And lastly, I want to thank Marcos for his unwavering support and leading during these times of difficulty when we're called to make a stand for justice. If you're interested in more resources like this, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or to anyone else on our HEDI team. We know that you have a lot of priorities, competing for your time. So thank you for setting aside these 90 minutes to have this conversation. I look forward to hearing about your successes and your challenges. Remember, this is a journey. So lead with love and listen to understand. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So much.
Hi, thank you.